She had stood in that ballroom for 11 years, beside him at every funeral, every negotiation, every silent war that never made it into the papers. And this was how it ended. Not with a bullet, not with a whispered threat, with a necklace. Damien Viscari lifted the family crest from his own chest, the ancient silver medallion that 5 generations of Viscari blood had died protecting, and he placed it around Vanessa Hale's neck like she was being crowned. And Seraphine watched. She didn't flinch, didn't reach for her wine glass, didn't let a single muscle in her jaw move. She had survived 11 years in this world by learning that the most dangerous thing a woman could do in a room full of killers was let them see her bleed. But inside, something cracked open that she knew would never fully close again. If you've ever been erased by someone who couldn't see what they had until they'd already given it away, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The Moretti estate had stood on the edge of the Hudson for over 100 years. Not the kind of old that gets restored and photographed for magazines. The kind of old that absorbs everything. Cigar smoke and whiskey and dried blood and deals sealed with a handshake that meant more than any contract a lawyer ever drafted. The walls had heard confessions that never reached a priest. The floors had held the weight of men who moved entire economies without appearing in a single financial record. Tonight, those same walls held the 5 families. The rite of blood happened once a year, always in winter, always at the Moretti estate by tradition that predated anyone currently breathing. It wasn't a party, it wasn't a celebration, it was a reckoning. An annual reassertion that the criminal architecture holding New York together still stood, that the old agreement still held, that the men in this room still recognized each other as the only law that actually mattered. Seraphine had attended every one of these nights for 11 years. She knew the rituals. She knew which Dawn preferred to stand near the east wall because the acoustic dead zone there made it impossible to lip read from across the room. She knew which capos were drinking too much this year compared to last. She knew which alliances had shifted simply by watching who stood near whom during the first hour, before anyone relaxed enough to stop performing. She had never been invited into the inner circle of these evenings. She had simply learned it all anyway. The dress she wore was deep charcoal, not black, which read as mourning, not ivory, which read as provocation. Charcoal said nothing, which was exactly the point. Her hair was pulled back in a way that looked effortless and had taken 40 minutes. The only jewelry she wore was a thin platinum bracelet on her left wrist, a gift from the Sicilian Don, Aldo Ferrante, who had pressed it into her hands 3 years ago, after she had quietly prevented a turf war that would have cost both families $100 million and a dozen lives. He hadn't explained why he was giving it to her. He didn't have to. She had understood then what she was becoming in this world, even if no one had said it out loud. She understood it even more clearly now, watching her husband lift that medallion from his chest. Damien Viscari was not a stupid man. That was the part that made this so hard to process. He was 39 years old and had run the Viscari syndicate for 8 of those years, with a combination of instinct, controlled fury, and a political intelligence that most men in his position never developed. He had negotiated peace with the Moretti family after a 3-year Cold War. He had restructured the syndicate's financial operations to survive 3 federal crackdowns without a single conviction. He had done things that should have been impossible, and he had done them because he was genuinely capable. What he had never been capable of was seeing Seraphine clearly. Not once in 11 years. Vanessa Hale stood beside him in a gown the color of red wine. Deliberate, Seraphine noted, chosen to read as power and appetite simultaneously. She was 32, and she wore ambition the way other women wore perfume, constantly, in every room, so that it arrived before she did. She had been in Damien's orbit for 14 months. She had understood within the first 2 weeks exactly what she wanted from him, and she had spent the 13 months since engineering every interaction to move toward it with the patience of a woman who had learned early that desire was a tool, and that men who believed they were being wanted were the easiest to steer. Seraphine had watched the whole thing unfold with the particular exhaustion of a woman who sees a train coming and is locked to the track. She had tried once to say something, 8 months ago, in the kitchen of their apartment on the Upper West Side, at 6 in the morning when the building was quiet, and Damien was still human enough to listen. She had said, "I think Vanessa is building something. I don't know what it is yet, but I think you should look at her more carefully. Damien had poured his coffee and said, without turning around, "You think every woman near me is building something." Seraphine had said nothing after that. She had simply started watching more carefully herself. The ballroom was arranged the way it always was for the rite. Long tables pushed to the walls, the center floor cleared. Enough space for 140 men to stand and face the Veskari patriarch without obstruction. The chandeliers overhead threw light that was warm and slightly gold, the kind of light that made everyone look more powerful than they were. The five family patriarchs had already taken their positions. Ferrante from the Sicilian contingent on the far left, Corrado della Mara in the center, the Tran brothers from the East Side operation flanking him, Bojan Vukovic from the Balkan Alliance on the far right. Each man had between 4 and 8 soldiers visible behind them. Every visible soldier had twice as many invisible ones somewhere in the building. This was what passed for a formal gathering in this world. Damien had moved to the center of the room at exactly 9:15. He was good at moments like this. Seraphine had always acknowledged that about him, even now, even as her hands stayed perfectly still at her sides. He had a physical authority that didn't require volume. He didn't need to raise his voice to fill a room. He simply stood in a way that suggested the room had always been waiting for him to arrive. He spoke briefly. Something about the year past. Something about loyalty and commitment and the Veskari name. Seraphine had heard variations of this speech many times, and she let it move through her without fully landing, watching instead the faces of the men arranged in front of him, watching the micro-expressions, the slight shift in Ferrante's chin, the way Della Mara's right hand moved slightly toward his coat and then stopped. They already knew. That was what she registered first, with a cold clarity that moved from her stomach upward to her chest. The patriarchs already knew what was coming. She could see it in the way they held themselves, not the loose watchfulness of men who were simply present for a ceremony, but the braced stillness of men waiting for a mistake they could not prevent. Then Damien reached up and removed the crest. The room didn't go quiet gradually. It went quiet the way a power line snapping goes quiet, total and immediate, with an undertow of something dangerous in the silence beneath. Seraphine counted 3 seconds before she understood what she was seeing. Then Vanessa stepped forward, and Damien placed the medallion around her neck, and the smile that moved across Vanessa's face was not the smile of a woman receiving a gift. It was the smile of a woman taking what she had already decided was hers. Seraphine's first thought was not about the insult. It was not about the betrayal or the humiliation or the quiet destruction of 11 years of marriage in a single motion. Her first thought was precise and tactical. The crest carries no actual legal or institutional authority. Whoever holds it is only as powerful as the men in this room agree to recognize. And the men in this room? She looked at Ferrante. He was already looking at her. He lowered his head. Not to Damien, not to Vanessa, to her. She held his gaze for exactly the length of a breath. Then she looked at Della Mara. He had done the same, chin dropped, eyes on the floor, the gesture so subtle that anyone who didn't know the protocol would miss it entirely. She looked at Vukovic, at the Tran brothers, at every patriarch in the room, all of them, every one of them. Seraphine felt something move through her that she would not have been able to name in that moment. Not triumph, not grief, not anger. Something colder and quieter than all three. The recognition that something had been confirmed that she had never allowed herself to fully believe before tonight. The room had gone completely still. Vanessa was still smiling. She hadn't looked at the patriarchs yet. She was looking at Damien and at the soldiers arranged around the ballroom, waiting for the applause that she had apparently assumed would come. It didn't come. Damien turned slowly, reading the room the way he always read rooms. She watched him scan the faces, watched the moment he found Ferrante's bowed head, the moment he found Della Mara's, the moment the confusion started building behind his eyes, that specific expression she had seen on his face maybe 4 times in 11 years, the one that meant the intelligence was arriving faster than his pride could process it. He looked at Seraphine. She looked back. She gave him nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not grief. She had learned in this world that the most powerful position in any room was the one where you could not be read, and she had been practicing it so long that it had stopped being performance and become simply who she was. Vanessa followed Damien's eyeline to Seraphine, and for the first time that evening, something shifted behind her expression. Not fear, not yet, but the first faint edge of calculation, the sense that something in this room was not behaving the way her models had predicted. One of the younger capos near the back, a Vescari loyalist named Piero, who had been with the family for 6 years and was deeply devoted to Damien, started to raise his glass. A toast. Instinctive, reflexive, the trained response of a man who understood that his boss had just made a public gesture and that his job was to affirm it. The man standing beside Piero put a hand on his arm without looking at him. The glass stayed down. Vanessa turned toward the patriarchs for the first time. Seraphine watched her take in what she was seeing: the lowered heads, the silence, the expressions of men who were actively declining to perform the validation she had expected. For a half-second, Vanessa's composure slipped just enough to be visible if you were watching closely. Her chin lifted, her jaw set. Her eyes moved to Damien with a question she didn't speak out loud. Damien didn't have an answer. He was still looking at his wife. "Is there something I've missed?" he said, quietly enough that only the people nearest him could hear. It wasn't a question directed at her, it was directed at the room, at the air, at whatever invisible architecture he was only now beginning to sense existed, the architecture that his own empire had been built on without his knowledge. Seraphine said nothing. She reached for her wine glass. She took a single, deliberate sip, and then she set the glass back down on the table beside her with a sound so small it should have been inaudible, and somehow, in that total silence, in that room full of the most dangerous men in the city, it landed like a period at the end of a sentence everyone had been waiting for someone to finish. Across the room, Aldo Ferrante exhaled. He was 73 years old and had survived 6 attempts on his life and the collapse of 2 Sicilian alliances that should have destroyed his family. He had been coming to this estate for 31 years. He had watched 3 generations of Vescari men try to hold this empire together. He had watched every one of them make the mistake of believing the empire held together because of them. He looked at the silver medallion resting against Vanessa Hale's collarbone. He looked at the woman standing quietly near the east wall with a wine glass and an expression that revealed nothing. He thought about the encrypted call he had received 8 months ago, at 2 in the morning, from a voice he had not recognized until she told him who she was. He thought about the 3 hours they had spent on that call, the documents that had arrived at his estate in Sicily by courier 4 days later, the agreements she had quietly renegotiated on the Vescari family's behalf with the Marseille operation and the Zurich financial channel, agreements that Damien had received credit for in the reports his own capos filed, because Seraphine had made sure the credit landed on her husband's name and never on hers. He thought about all of that. Then he looked at Damien Vescari, this brilliant, capable, genuinely gifted man, standing in the center of his own ballroom with an expression of mounting confusion on his face, beginning to understand for the first time that the floor he was standing on had been held in place by hands he had never once bothered to look down and see. Ferrante turned to the man on his left, an advisor who had been with him for 20 years, and said something in Sicilian that was too quiet for anyone more than a foot away to catch. The advisor nodded once. Whatever it was, it had already been decided. Down by the south entrance, 3 of Damien's most senior capos had gathered in a tight cluster, speaking in voices below the threshold of the room's ambient sound. Seraphine clocked them without turning her head. Peripheral vision and 11 years of practice at monitoring rooms without appearing to. She could read the body language from 40 feet. They weren't debating. They were confirming. Something had already been decided between them before tonight, and tonight had simply provided the moment to acknowledge it. One of them, a man named Costello, who had served the Vescari family for 19 years and whose absolute loyalty to Damien had never once been in question, looked across the room at Seraphine with an expression that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite relief, but was something in between. Then he stepped backward, out of the cluster, and moved to stand behind her. Seraphine kept her face completely still. Inside her chest, something that had been clenched tight for a very long time began, very slowly, with enormous caution, to loosen. Vanessa had seen it too. She was good. Seraphine had always been honest with herself about that. The woman was genuinely skilled at reading rooms and reading people, and she had just watched a senior capo defect from the cluster of men flanking her position and crossed the room to stand behind the wife she had spent 14 months systematically undermining. The smile was still on her face, but it had gone rigid at the edges, the kind of expression that is maintained by will rather than feeling. She leaned close to Damien's ear. Seraphine was too far away to hear what she said, but she could see Damien's jaw tighten, could see the color change slightly at the back of his neck, could see the moment his confusion began converting, the way she had watched it convert before, many times, in many rooms, into something harder and more dangerous. Anger was Damien's default resolution for confusion. It always had been. It was probably the thing that had kept him alive as long as it had, and it was almost certainly the thing that was going to finish destroying him if he didn't learn to pause before it arrived. He turned to the room. "Is there someone here?" he said, and his voice had changed. Not loud, but carrying, the way a blade carries even when it isn't moving. "Who wants to explain what I'm seeing?" Silence. Not the deferential silence of men waiting for their boss to finish speaking. The particular silence of men who have decided, collectively, not to be the one to say the thing that everyone in the room already knows. Damien looked at Ferrante. "Don Ferrante." Ferrante raised his eyes. He looked at Damien with the expression of a man who has watched a great deal of history and understands that most of it is irreversible. He said nothing, which, in this room, among these men, said everything. Damien looked at Della Mara, at Vukovic, at the Tran brothers. Each one of them met his eyes and offered him the same gift of silence, the same refusal to be the one to explain to this man what he had just done to himself. Seraphine set her wineglass down again. She turned, for the first time since the medallion had left her husband's hands, and walked toward the doors at the far end of the ballroom. Not quickly, not as though she was fleeing, with the measured pace of a woman who has somewhere specific to be and intends to arrive there on her own terms. Behind her, she heard the sound of footsteps. One set, then three, then more. She did not turn to look. She didn't need to. By the time she reached the doors, she could hear, in the room behind her, the sound of Damien's voice, beginning to rise, beginning to break through the controlled register he usually maintained, asking questions that the room was declining to answer, demanding explanations from men who had already decided, quietly and without drama, that the explanations they owed were owed to someone else. She pushed through the doors. The cold air of the corridor hit her face. She breathed. For the first time in 11 years, in this world, in this life, she had made herself fit into one careful adaptation at a time. She breathed without calculating what the breath would look like to the people around her. Because for the first time, the people around her were not watching to see if she was weak. They were watching to see where she was going, and she already knew exactly where that was. The corridor outside the ballroom was long and badly lit, the kind of institutional dimness that old money estates never bothered to fix because the people who moved through them had long ago stopped needing to see clearly. Wall sconces threw amber pools every 15 feet. Between them, shadow. Seraphine moved through both without adjusting her pace. She heard the door open behind her, not the flood of sound she might have expected, not the ballroom spilling out into the corridor, not Damien's voice carrying after her. Just one set of footsteps, measured, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who had been walking toward difficult conversations for most of his adult life and had made a kind of peace with the distance. She didn't slow down. "Mrs. Vescari." Costello. She had known it would be Costello. Of all the men who had peeled away from the cluster near the south entrance tonight, he was the one whose decision mattered most. Not because he commanded the most resources, but because his loyalty to Damien was the kind that was supposed to be unconditional. When men like Costello started making conditional decisions, the architecture of an organization began to shift in ways that couldn't be reversed. She stopped walking. She turned to face him. I was 51, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had absorbed enough of life's harder deliveries that it had stopped trying to look any particular way. He held his hat in his hands, an old habit from a different era, a gesture of respect that he probably wasn't consciously aware of making. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't owe me anything. I've been with Damien for 19 years. He said it the way men say things they're trying to understand by hearing them out loud. I would have walked into traffic for that man. You know that. I know that. And I need you to understand." He stopped, started again. "What happened tonight? What I did tonight. It wasn't against him. Seraphine looked at him steadily. Costello, what happened tonight was the result of a long time of things happening that you and I both let go too long without addressing. Don't waste the next 10 minutes explaining yourself. You have maybe 30 seconds before Damien comes through that door, and you need to decide right now what you're going to do with those 30 seconds. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of a thing he had suspected for a long time and was only now letting himself acknowledge. There are 14 captains in that room, he said. Of those 14, 9 of them have been receiving intelligence reports through channels that Damien doesn't know exist. Someone has been feeding them information, accurate information about threats the syndicate was facing that never made it into Damien's briefings. Seraphine said nothing. The Zurich account that got frozen last spring, Costello continued. Damien thought it was a federal flag. It wasn't. Someone pulled $47 million out of a subsidiary account 4 days before the freeze. Someone who had access to the account structure and knew exactly which transfer would be invisible to the audit trail. That money was moved to protect it, Seraphine said. It's in a clean account in the Cayman structure, the full amount plus 11 months of interest. Costello stared at her. You can verify it yourself, she said. The access codes are in a sealed envelope in the secondary safe at the estate. Damien has never asked about the secondary safe because Damien has always believed the primary safe contains everything that matters. For a moment, Costello simply stood there in the amber light, holding his hat, processing. Then he exhaled, a long, slow, almost exhausted sound. How long? He said. How long what? How long have you been… He didn't finish the sentence because he couldn't find the right word for what he was asking. Running things? She offered. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. I haven't been running things, Seraphine said carefully. Damien runs the Viscari Syndicate. Everything I've done has been in support of that. Every alliance, every financial move, every quiet negotiation, it was all aimed at protecting what he built. I never wanted the authority. I wanted the outcome. Then why didn't you tell him? It was such a simple question that it almost made her laugh. She didn't. She looked at this man who had spent 19 years watching her husband operate, and she said, as plainly as she knew how, because he wouldn't have let me keep doing it. The door at the far end of the corridor opened. Damien came through it like a weather system. Not running, not shouting, but carrying that specific energy of a man who has just had something important taken from him and hasn't yet decided whether he's going to burn the building down or find a more precise instrument. 2 of his personal security detail flanked him, close but not crowding. Behind him, Vanessa. Seraphine watched Vanessa's eyes find Costello first, the quick calculation behind them, the assessment of what it meant that this particular man was standing in this corridor talking to this particular woman. Then Vanessa's eyes moved to Seraphine, and there it was. That thing that Seraphine had been watching for 14 months, the thing that Vanessa was usually disciplined enough to keep submerged. For 3 full seconds, before the composure came back down like a shade being drawn, what was in Vanessa Hale's eyes was not ambition and not desire, and not the polished confidence she wore in every other room. It was calculation of a very specific kind, the kind that doesn't ask whether something is right, the kind that only asks whether it can still be controlled. Damien stopped 8 feet away from his wife. You want to tell me what that was? He said. Not a question. The grammatical form of a question deployed as a demand. No, Seraphine said. The word landed in the corridor and sat there. Behind Damien, one of the security detail, a young man named Ricci, who had been assigned to Damien's personal protection for 3 months, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Seraphine filed it away. No, Damien repeated. You're asking me to explain the room to you. I'm telling you I won't do that. Seraphine, what you saw in there is something you need to understand on your own terms. If I explain it to you, you'll hear my explanation, not the truth. And right now the truth matters more than either of our interpretations of it. Damien looked at Costello. Something moved across his face, something rawer than the controlled authority, something that belonged to a man rather than a boss. Tony. Costello met his eyes. Damien. You want to explain to me why you were standing behind my wife instead of next to me? Costello was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who said hard things honestly rather than kindly, which was probably why Damien had kept him close for 19 years. Because that's where I needed to be. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, that presses down on the people inside it. Then Vanessa stepped forward from behind Damien's shoulder, and her voice was exactly calibrated, warm at the surface, with something metallic underneath that only revealed itself if you were paying close attention. I think what Tony is trying to say, she said, is that some people in that room have been spending a long time building a very specific kind of loyalty to someone who isn't you. Costello turned to look at her. The look on his face was not anger. It was something quieter and more dangerous than anger. It was the expression of a man who has just watched someone reach for something they don't understand and doesn't intend to explain why they should put it back down. Miss Hale, he said. Just her name. Nothing attached to it. It was enough. Vanessa's composure didn't crack, but something behind her eyes recalculated. Damien, Seraphine's voice was level. I'm going to go to the car. When you've finished whatever you're going to do next, come home. We can talk there, but not here, not in this corridor, and not tonight with her standing 3 feet away from us. She didn't say her with any particular emphasis. She didn't need to. She turned and walked toward the main entrance. She felt Damien watching her. She felt the specific quality of his attention. The frustrated, bewildered, pride-wounded attention of a man who is being given something that looks like dignity but feels from inside like being dismissed. She knew him well enough to know that the ride home would be worse than the ballroom. The ballroom had witnesses, which constrained him. The car would not. She walked out into the cold. The car was warm and smelled faintly of leather, and the particular air freshener that the driver, Marco, had been using for 4 years. Seraphine sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the Hudson and did not allow herself to think about anything for exactly 2 minutes. She had learned this practice in her 3rd year of marriage, when the sustained vigilance of this life had started making the silence between events feel more threatening than the events themselves. 2 minutes of genuine blankness. Then she would allow herself to begin processing. Marco pulled smoothly onto the access road without being told. He had been her driver specifically, not Damien's, hers, for 7 years. He had driven her to meetings she had never told Damien about. He had waited in parking structures while she sat in the back of other cars, having conversations that had shaped the Viscari Syndicate's survival at least 3 times over. He never asked questions. He never repeated anything he heard. He was probably the most trustworthy person she knew in this city, which was a statement both about him and about this city. Her phone lit up before they had gone 2 miles. The number was one she recognized but had not expected to see tonight. She looked at it for a moment, then answered. Don Ferrante. She kept her voice neutral. My dear. His voice was old and dry and precise, the voice of a man who chose every syllable deliberately. You understand what happens next. I'm beginning to. He will go home, and he will be angry, and she will be there to direct the anger. She is very good at that. I have been watching her direct his anger for 14 months, and she has not made a mistake yet. I know. The question is what you intend to do about the accounts. She was quiet for a moment. Which accounts specifically? The Marchetti channel. The intermediary in Rotterdam has been contacted. Someone has been making inquiries about the account structure there, specifically about which names appear on the signature authorities. Seraphine felt the cold she had stepped out of outside the estate move through her from the inside now. When? 3 days ago. 3 days ago. 2 days before the right. Before tonight. Which meant the inquiry was not a reaction to what had happened in the ballroom. Which meant the ballroom had been a distraction. A performance designed to pull every significant set of eyes in the New York underworld toward the spectacle of the medallion and Vanessa's smile and the patriarch's silence, while something else moved in the background where no one was looking. The Marchetti channel has 7 accounts, she said carefully. Someone already knows that. Who made the inquiry in Rotterdam? Ferrante was quiet for just long enough that she understood the pause was its own answer. Someone using credentials that belonged to the Viscari primary office, he said finally. Primary office credentials. Not syndicate credentials. Not Damien's personal authorization. The primary office ran on a system that 3 people had access to. Damien, his financial director, and the administrative coordinator who had been managing the office infrastructure for 6 years. The financial director was a man named Graves, who had been with the family for 11 years and whose loyalty Seraphine had never had any reason to question. The administrative coordinator was a woman named Patricia Chen, who had been hired 14 months ago on a recommendation from a staffing agency that Seraphine had, at the time, been too focused on other things to fully vet. 14 months. Don Ferrante, she said, I need 24 hours. You have less than that, he said, but I will give you what I can. The call ended. Seraphine looked out the window. The Hudson was dark and wide and moving the way it always moved, indifferent to everything happening on its banks. She had lived in this city for 11 years, and she still found the river's indifference clarifying rather than bleak. It didn't care about the Vescari syndicate or the Five Families or the silver medallion or the woman wearing it. It had been moving before any of this existed, and it would be moving after all of it was gone. She had work to do. Damien arrived home 40 minutes after she did. She heard the front door, not slammed, which was more concerning. Damien slamming doors meant the anger was still surface level, still hot and reactive and manageable. Damien closing doors quietly meant something had gotten into him deeper than the surface, had cooled in the car and taken root. She was in the study. She had made coffee because she needed the routine of it, needed to have something to do with her hands, while the faster part of her brain ran the Ferrante callback through itself, examining each word for the weight he had put into it. She heard his footsteps in the hall. She heard them stop outside the study door. He came in and sat down on the far side of the room. She looked at him. He was still in his formal wear. He had loosened the tie but not removed it. He was holding a glass of something amber. He'd stopped in the kitchen first, which meant he had needed a minute to decide what version of this conversation he was going to have. He hadn't decided yet. She could see it in the way his hands were holding the glass, too tight across the knuckles. Patricia Chen, she said. He blinked. What? Your administrative coordinator. I need her access to the primary office system suspended tonight. Not terminated, not investigated. Suspended. Before 6 a.m. Seraphine, I just walked in I know when you walked in. Patricia Chen has been using primary office credentials to make inquiries into the Marchetti Channel accounts in Rotterdam. Someone with access to those accounts is currently trying to identify the signature authorities on 7 accounts that the syndicate needs to remain undisturbed. If that information gets out before I can move the accounts, every financial channel the Vistari syndicate has in Europe closes within 48 hours. Silence. Damien set his glass down, slowly, with the care of a man who is doing something with his hands while his brain catches up. How do you know about the Marchetti Channel? He said. Because I built the Marchetti Channel, she said. 3 years ago when the Zurich route was flagged, I needed an alternative and I built one. The silence this time had a different quality, denser. The silence of a man holding very still because the ground under him is shifting and he doesn't know yet in which direction. You built a financial channel, he said slowly, without telling me. I built it to protect you. She kept her voice level, not defensive, not apologetic. These were facts and she delivered them as facts. The Zurich flag would have frozen $12 million in operating funds during the Moretti negotiation if I hadn't had an alternative already in place. The negotiation would have collapsed. The Moretti alliance cost you 2 years of groundwork. Losing it then would have cost you the eastern supply route and, conservatively, 40% of the syndicate's northern operations. You built a financial channel, Damien said again, not because he hadn't heard her, but because he needed to say it a second time while a third version of it settled somewhere inside him, and you didn't tell me. Yes, because you didn't think I could handle it. Because I knew you would have told me to stop. She said it simply, without cruelty and without softening. You would have told me it wasn't my place. You would have shut it down because you would have needed to, because the alternative was accepting that your wife had built something significant inside your own operation without your authorization, and that was not something you were going to accept. And the channel would have been lost, and the Moretti negotiation would have collapsed, and we would be having a very different conversation right now about the state of the northern operations. Damien stood up. He crossed to the window. He stood there with his back to her, looking at the city, doing the thing he did when the anger was trying to find a shape that was useful rather than just destructive. She had watched him do it hundreds of times. She had always privately thought it was one of his better qualities. The fact that he could feel something at full volume and still choose most of the time to find the productive form of it. "How much?" he said to the window. "How much of what I think I built did you build without telling me?" She thought about the Moretti Peace Treaty, the Rotterdam Channel, the Bangkok supply rerouting after the federal sweep in 2019, the 3 assassination attempts she had quietly neutralized through intelligence channels that Damien's own security team had never managed to penetrate, the deal with the Tran brothers that had secured the East Side Agreement, a deal that Damien believed he had negotiated himself because she had made very sure the framework existed before she ever put it in front of him as something for him to close. "Enough," she said. He didn't turn around. "The question right now," she continued, "is not about what I did or didn't tell you. The question is about Patricia Chen and the Rotterdam inquiry and what it means that someone has been trying to map our financial structure. Because whoever is driving that is Vanessa," Damien said. He said it to the window, quiet, flat. Seraphine said nothing. He turned around. His face was not what she expected, not the controlled fury, not the pride-wounded commander energy. He looked, in this moment, genuinely tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from one evening, but from a long time of carrying something heavy while insisting you didn't find it heavy. "I know how that sounds," he said. "Damien, I know how it sounds. I just put a chain around her neck in front of every family in New York, and I'm standing in my own study telling my wife that—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "Tell me I'm wrong. About Chen. Tell me it's someone else." She looked at him steadily. Chen was recommended to the primary office by a staffing agency that was incorporated 8 months before Vanessa entered your life. The agency has 3 other clients. All 3 are businesses with ties to the Calvetti operation out of Chicago. The Calvetti... He stopped. The Calvetti family has been hostile to Vescari interests for 6 years. Yes. He sat back down. He picked up his glass. He put it back down without drinking from it. "She came to me," he said quietly. "Vanessa. She came to me, Seraphine. I didn't go looking. She was at the Delacourt event 18 months ago, and she..." He stopped. Ran a hand over his face. "I need to think." "You need to make a call," she said. "Chen's access. Tonight." "I heard you." "Before 6 a.m. "I heard you." She stood, crossed to the desk, picked up the phone that sat there, a landline, one of 2 she maintained in the house on old-fashioned principle, because landlines were harder to intercept than anything wireless, and set it in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. For a moment she saw it again, that thing she had loved about this man before the empire got between them. The raw intelligence, the instinct for the essential thing underneath all the noise. He had always been able to find the load-bearing element of any situation if he could get himself quiet enough to look for it. The problem was that getting him quiet enough had become increasingly difficult as the empire grew and the noise grew with it. He picked up the phone. He made the call. She listened to him instruct the night security manager, quietly, without explanation, with the clipped authority of a man who did not need to justify his decisions, to suspend Patricia Chen's system access effective immediately. The call took 40 seconds. He set the phone down. "Now," he said. "Now, will you tell me what's actually happening?" She sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the desk. She thought about all of it, where to begin, how much to say, how much he was actually capable of receiving tonight given everything the evening had already cost him. She thought about Ferrante's voice on the phone. She is very good at directing his anger. She thought about the Rotterdam inquiry. 3 days ago. Before tonight. She thought about the administrative coordinator hired 14 months ago. She thought about 14 months of Vanessa Hale inside the orbit of the Vescari syndicate, and she thought about what a person with Vanessa's specific skills and patience could learn in 14 months if she was looking for the right things. She thought about the 7 accounts in the Marchetti channel. And then she thought about the thing she had not yet told Damien, the thing that Ferrante had told her at the end of the call, quietly and almost as an afterthought, in the way that men who have been in this world for a very long time sometimes deliver the most important information, as though it is almost too painful to give full weight, so they carry it gently and set it down at the edge of the conversation and let the other person pick it up. 3 of the 9 captains who had been receiving intelligence through the alternate channels, Ferrante had told her. 3 of those 9 had stopped responding 3 days ago. At the same time, the Rotterdam inquiry was made. She met Damien's eyes across the desk. "I need you to listen to me," she said, "and I need you to do something you haven't done in a very long time." "What's that?" "Trust me before you understand why." He looked at her. The room was quiet around them. Somewhere below, the city kept moving, indifferent, relentless, carrying all its invisible weight forward into the next moment and the next. "The 3 captains who have gone silent," she said, "Piero, Santino, and Mace, do you know where they are right now?" Something crossed Damien's face. Something that had been sleeping got up very fast. "They were at the estate tonight," he said. "They were at the estate tonight," she confirmed, "and none of them came home." The glass in Damien's hand cracked, not from pressure, or not only from pressure. From the way his hand had gone suddenly rigid, the kind of involuntary full-body response that no amount of discipline can fully train out of a person when the information arriving is bad enough. The crack was hairline, barely visible, and the liquid inside it began very slowly to move toward the fissure. He didn't notice. He was already standing, already reaching for the other phone, the encrypted one, the one his security director answered at any hour. And his voice when he spoke into it was the voice of a man who has just understood that the battle he thought he was fighting was a decoy, and that the real engagement started 3 days ago without him, and that he is already behind in a way that the next several hours may not be enough to correct. Seraphine watched him. She thought, this is the moment. Not the ballroom, not the medallion, not the patriarchs lowering their heads. Those had been the visible architecture of a shift that had already happened long before tonight. The surface expression of something that had been building for years in the invisible structures that Damien had never bothered to look at, because he had always been too confident that the visible ones were sufficient. This was the moment the ground stopped pretending to be solid. She reached into her jacket pocket and removed a small drive, matte black, the size of a thumb, with no identifying markings. She set it on the desk between them. Damien finished the call, looked at the drive. "What is that?" 14 months of documentation, she said. "Everything I've been collecting since she arrived. Financial transfers, communication intercepts, the Chicago connection. 3 more names I haven't said out loud yet because saying them in this room until tonight would have cost you more than I was prepared to let it cost you." He looked at the drive. He looked at her. "Why tonight?" he said. She reached out and placed one finger on the drive, just the tip of her index finger, resting on it. "Because tonight," she said, "it stopped being something I could protect you from quietly." The encrypted phone in his hand lit up. He looked at it, read whatever had come through. She watched the color change in his face, not drain exactly, but shift, the way light shifts when something passes in front of it. He set the phone face down on the desk. He did not tell her what the message said. He didn't have to. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular angle of a man who has just received confirmation of the thing he most did not want to be true, and who is now standing at the exact edge of a decision that cannot be unmade once he makes it. "The 3 captains," she said quietly. "Gone," he said. His voice had gone very flat. "Santino's wife called the security line 20 minutes ago. He never came home from the estate. His phone is off. His car is at the estate parking structure." The cold that moved through Seraphine this time was not strategic. It was the simple human cold of understanding that 3 men who had been alive this morning were not alive now, and that whatever she had managed to protect and preserve and quietly hold together for 11 years had just moved past the boundary where quiet preservation was sufficient. "Damien," she kept her voice steady, "look at me." He looked at her. "Whatever comes next," she said, "I need you to understand one thing before it starts. What Vanessa has been building is not a power grab. It's not about the medallion, and it's not about you, and it's not about me. She's been working a demolition. She wants the syndicate fractured. She wants the family alliances broken. She has been working toward that from the first day she walked into your orbit, and every decision you've made in the last 14 months that moved in that direction, including tonight, was a decision she engineered." He was very still. "The question," Seraphine said, "is not whether you believe me." "Then what's the question?" She looked at him across the desk, across 11 years, across a marriage that had never been simple, across an empire that he had believed was entirely his, and that had survived as long as it had partly because of the invisible hands of the woman sitting across from him now. The question, she said, is whether you still have the relationships you'd need to stop what's already in motion, because she hasn't been waiting for tonight to start the next part. Outside the window, the city moved. Below them, somewhere in the cold streets, 3 men were not going home to their families. And in an apartment that Seraphine knew the address of and had known for 11 months and had chosen until tonight, not to mention, Vanessa Hale picked up a phone and made a call that would reach Chicago before morning, carrying with it the confirmation that the first stage had gone exactly as planned and that the second stage could now begin. The drive sat on the desk between them, like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Damien looked at it for a long time without touching it. His hand, the one that had cracked the glass, was bleeding slightly at the base of the thumb where a hairline shard had caught the skin. He hadn't noticed. A thin red line had drawn itself down toward his wrist and stopped there, drying. He noticed it and said nothing because the blood was not the emergency, and they both understood that. "Chicago," he said finally. "You're telling me Vanessa has been running a Chicago operation inside my house for 14 months, and you've known about it for 11 of those months and you said nothing." "I said nothing because I didn't have enough to bring you. You have a drive. I have a drive now. 3 months ago I had half a drive. 6 months ago I had suspicions and a financial thread I couldn't fully trace without tipping her off that someone was looking. And the 3 captains." His voice had gone to a place below anger, below the range where most people kept their emotional registers. It was the voice of a man operating in a zone where the feelings had been temporarily suspended because the machine needed to run, and feelings were friction. She had heard it once before, 4 years ago, when the Moretti Cold War had come within 36 hours of going hot, and Damien had spent 2 days making decisions that she knew cost him something deep and that he had never fully discussed afterward. Piero, Santino, Mace, they were receiving intelligence through your alternate channels. Yes. Intelligence you were running. Yes. So they were loyal to you. She held his gaze. They were loyal to the syndicate. The channel I ran gave them information that kept them and their crews alive on 3 separate occasions when Damien's official intelligence failed to flag threats in time. Their loyalty followed the information that was keeping them alive. That's not sentiment, Damien. That's how this world works, and you know it. He stood up abruptly, crossed to the window again. She let him go. He needed the movement, needed the distance of the glass between himself and the city, the sense of looking at something external, while the internal systems reorganized themselves around an entirely new map of their situation. "Call Ferrante," he said. "I already spoke to Ferrante." He turned. "When?" "In the car. On the way home. He called me." The look that moved across Damien's face was complex enough that she couldn't fully read it, which was unusual. She could usually read him. After 11 years, she had cataloged his expressions the way a linguist catalogues phonemes. The meaningful units beneath the surface, the things that carried weight regardless of what the face was doing on top. But this one had too many things happening simultaneously. The recognition that Ferrante had called her instead of him. The recognition of what that meant. The recognition that this recognition was itself a data point in the larger picture she had been trying to describe to him. "He called you," Damien said. "Yes." A muscle in his jaw moved. He turned back to the window. She watched his shoulders, the specific architecture of tension across them, which muscles were engaged and which had released, the way the body tells the truth, even when the face is working to contain it. "The Marchetti accounts," she said. "I need to move them before morning." "Move them where?" "There's a secondary structure, clean, outside the European banking system entirely. It's been in place for 8 months as a contingency." "A contingency you built?" "Yes." He was quiet. "Damien, the accounts." "Do it." He said it to the window. Flat and immediate, the decision made before he'd fully processed all of it, which was, she recognized this, his way of trusting her before the pride finished arguing against it. She had watched him do this a handful of times over 11 years. It was always the best version of him. It never lasted. She picked up her phone and sent 3 words to a number that did not appear in any contact list on any device Damien had ever handled. The words were a code. The code would initiate a transfer sequence that a man in the Cayman Islands who had been on her payroll for 6 years would execute within the next 2 hours without requiring any further instruction from her. She set the phone down. "There's something else," she said. He turned from the window. The look on his face told her he already knew, not the specifics, but the shape of it, the fact of a further layer. The understanding that the thing she had just said, "There's something else," was the sentence she had been building toward since she sat down at this desk, and the one that was going to cost the most. "The Calvetti operation," she said. "I told you Vanessa's connection to Chicago, the staffing agency, the administrative coordinator, the account mapping. That's the operational layer. But the Calvetti family doesn't move on its own. They take commissions. They've been a contract organization for 11 years. They don't have ideological investment in any particular outcome. They work for whoever is paying." Damien said nothing. He was very still. "I've been trying to trace the commission source for 3 months," Seraphine said. "The money that's been funding Vanessa's operation inside this syndicate. It's been routed carefully. Offshore layers, shell structures, the kind of financial architecture that takes serious resources to build and serious expertise to maintain. I couldn't get past the third layer." She paused. "Last week I got past the third layer." The room was so quiet she could hear the city through the glass. Distant, constant, indifferent. "Damien," she said, "the commission funding Vanessa's operation inside the Viscari syndicate came from the Viscari syndicate." He didn't move. She watched him process it, the specific sequence of it, the way a mind has to run through denial first, the reflexive rejection of the impossible thing, before it can arrive at the recognition that the impossible thing is actually just a fact, wearing a shape the mind hadn't anticipated. "That's not possible," he said. It's not just possible. It's documented. The drive has the transfer records. The source account is a subsidiary of the primary operating fund, SHEP. It's been drawing small amounts over 22 months. Amounts small enough that they read as administrative overhead in the quarterly reports. Individually, none of them would flag an audit. Aggregated over 22 months, they total $4.3 million. That's what funded Vanessa's operation. That's what paid the Calvetti contract. That's what hired Patricia Chen and built the staffing agency and mapped the Marchetti accounts. "Someone inside the syndicate funded it," Damien said. "Someone with access to the subsidiary accounts. Someone with signature authority on the subsidiary accounts," she said carefully. "There are 4 people with that authority. You, Graves, the primary office administrator, who was Chen, and whose access you just suspended, and 1 other." She watched him. She watched him count. She watched him move through the names, and she watched the moment he arrived at the 4th one, and she watched something in his face do what faces do when the ground they're standing on isn't there anymore. "No," he said. It came out quiet and reflexive, the word of a man who is buying himself 3 seconds to hold the world together before it reorganizes without his consent. "Costello," she said. "No." "Damien, Tony has been with me for 19 years. I know. He drove my father to the hospital the night my father had his stroke. He stood in the corridor for 6 hours. He was the one who—" He stopped. His jaw locked. "No, you're wrong. The account trace is wrong. Something is mislabeled. Something is—" "I ran the trace 4 times, she said. "I hired an independent analyst who doesn't know whose accounts they were looking at. I gave them sanitized data with identifying information removed. All 4 traces, including the independent one, resolved to the same signature authority." He was breathing through his nose. Short, controlled, the breath of a man keeping the volume down by force. "There's more," she said. "Don't." The word came out with an edge on it that she hadn't heard from him in a long time. "There's more, and you need to hear it." He looked at her. His eyes were doing something she recognized and hated. The thing where the emotion was so close to the surface that the eyes went slightly flat, the way eyes go when a person is using everything they have to keep the face from showing what's happening underneath it. "Costello was in the corridor tonight," she said. "He came out after me. He told me about the alternate intelligence channels, that 9 captains had been receiving information through them. He knew about the channels. He could have found out on his own. He named them, Damien. He told me the number, 9 captains. He told me the intelligence had been accurate. He told me about the Zurich account. He knew all of it." She leaned forward slightly. "The only way Costello knows all of that is if he's been watching my operation from inside it, not participating in it, watching it, mapping it for someone else." The silence stretched. "He came to stand behind me tonight," she said, "in the corridor. He crossed the room and stood behind me. of alignment with me. I thought, she stopped for a moment, allowed herself the honesty of it. I thought it meant something. I thought it was a genuine decision. And now? And now I think he crossed the room because he was told to, because the person directing Vanessa's operation needed Costello to appear to align with me in order to, she stopped again, ran it through. In order to create a fracture between me and Damien that looks like something I engineered. If Costello publicly aligns with me, it validates everything Vanessa has been telling you, that I've been building a parallel loyalty structure, that the captains who deferred to me tonight were my captains, not yours, that the whole thing was a coup. She met his eyes. Which means what happened in the ballroom tonight wasn't designed to give Vanessa power. It was designed to make me look like I was taking yours. Damien sat down. Not the controlled lowering of a man choosing to sit. The sit of a man whose legs made the decision before his mind did. He pressed both hands flat on the desk. He looked at them. She watched him sit with it, all of it, the whole architecture of it, the 22 months of careful construction that had been happening inside his own house, funded by his own money, operated by a man he had trusted longer than almost anyone alive. She watched him sit with the specific texture of that betrayal, which was different from other betrayals because it didn't just take something from him. It retroactively changed the meaning of 19 years. "Where is he?" Damien said. "I don't know. He was in the corridor 40 minutes ago." "He was. And then you came through the door, and he was gone before we went inside. I don't know where he went after that." Damien's hands pressed harder on the desk. The knuckles went white. The cut at his thumb had started bleeding again slightly, a fresh thread of red over the dried one. "I need to find him." "You need to be careful about how you look for him," she said. "If Costello is running surveillance on this house, and I think he is, I think he has been for at least 6 months, then any communication you make through standard channels to locate him will tell him that you know. And if he knows that you know, he will disappear before you can get to him. And if he disappears, we lose the only thread that leads us back up to whoever is actually running this above Vanessa." Damien looked at her. "You think there's someone above Vanessa?" "I think Vanessa is very good. I don't think she built this alone. $4.3 million, 22 months of planning, access to Calvetti contract resources, the sophistication of the financial layering. This is not one person's operation. This is an organization that decided to use one person as its visible instrument because that person happened to find a door into the Vescari orbit." "The door being me." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He stood up again. He was going to keep doing that, standing and sitting, the physical expression of a mind trying to find a position that was stable when no position was stable. She understood it. She let him do it. He crossed to the cabinet on the far wall, opened it, removed a phone she had never seen before, older, a model from at least 7 years ago, the kind that had been manufactured before the current generation of interception software could read it cleanly. He looked at it for a moment, turning it over in his hands. "My father gave me this," he said. "He said if there was ever a moment when I couldn't trust any channel I had, use this. He said he hoped I never needed to." He paused. "I thought he was being paranoid. I thought he was old and afraid, and that the world I was going to build wouldn't need emergency phones." He powered it on. She watched him dial a number from memory, not looking at anything, just dialing, the number clearly one he had carried for years without ever needing it. He waited. It rang 4 times. Then someone answered. Damien said simply, "It's time." He ended the call. She looked at him. "Who was that?" "Someone my father trusted when he trusted no one else." He set the old phone on the desk beside her drive. "Someone who has been waiting for this call for 9 years." Before she could respond, her own phone moved. Not a call. A message from the number she had used 20 minutes ago to initiate the Cayman transfer. She looked at it. The message was 4 words. Transfer blocked. Account frozen. She stared at the words. The Cayman account was a structure that Seraphine had built outside every channel connected to the Vescari syndicate. It was held under a corporate identity that had no legal connection to the Vescari name. It had never appeared in any document that had passed through the primary office. The only people who knew it existed were herself, the Cayman intermediary, and Ferrante, who had helped her structure it 3 years ago as a personal favor that had never been spoken about in any room where a third person was present. No one else knew it existed, which meant either the Cayman intermediary had talked, or Ferrante had talked, or someone had found it by a method she couldn't yet account for, or someone had found it because they hadn't been looking for the Cayman account specifically. They had been looking for Seraphine's financial signature, the specific patterns that she used when she built structures, the preferences and habits and idiosyncrasies that are as individual as a fingerprint and just as traceable to someone who knows what they're looking at. Someone had mapped her, the way she had been mapping Vanessa. "Damien," she said, and her voice came out differently than she intended, flatter, with something underneath it that she didn't usually allow into her voice in front of anyone. "The contingency account, it's frozen." He turned from the window. She held up the phone so he could see the message. He read it. His face didn't change in any visible way, which meant the thing that moved through him was too large to have a facial expression. The large ones always went still on his face. Only the medium-sized ones produced visible response. "That account doesn't exist in any Vescry record," she said. She heard herself saying it and heard, underneath the words, the thing she was not saying, which means they found it by finding me. Damien crossed back to the desk. He picked up the old phone his father had given him. He looked at it for a moment. Then it rang. Not his call going out. An incoming call on a number that, by definition, no one should have had. On a phone that had been sitting in a cabinet, powered off, for 9 years. They both looked at it. It rang a second time. Seraphine felt something cold move up the back of her neck. The specific cold that is not temperature. The cold that arrives when the situation reconfigures itself into a shape that is worse than the worst shape you had previously modeled. Damien picked it up. He answered without speaking. A voice came through, male, older, with the measured cadence of a man who has never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. She couldn't make out the words. She could only read Damien's face as he listened, and what she read there moved through the spectrum of his most controlled expressions and kept going, past all of them, into territory she had never seen on him before. He listened for approximately 90 seconds. Then he lowered the phone. He set it on the desk. He looked at his wife. "The man my father trusted," he said slowly. "The one I just called." He stopped. Started again. "His name is Raymond Gould. He ran security for my father for 16 years. He retired when my father died. He moved to Vermont. I haven't spoken to him in 9 years." "Damien, that was not Raymond Gould on this phone." The room held itself completely still. "Raymond Gould died 6 weeks ago," Damien said. "Apparent natural causes. Cardiac event at home, alone. No investigation. His body was found 3 days later by a neighbor." He looked at the phone on the desk. "Which means whoever just called on this number has been waiting for me to use it. Has been monitoring a dead man's emergency contact protocol for 6 weeks, waiting for the moment. I would feel cornered enough to reach for the last safe option my father left me." Seraphine stood up. She was thinking very fast now, moving through it. The frozen account, the old phone, the call, the 3 missing captains, the Rotterdam inquiry, all of it arranging itself into a single coherent picture that was so complete and so deliberate and so obviously the product of a very long, very patient, very well-resourced plan that the scale of it landed on her chest like something physical. "They've been planning this longer than 14 months, she said. "The voice on the phone," Damien said. Before he hung up, he said, he stopped. Something in his face went through a change that she watched happen and could not fully read even now. He said, "Tell your wife that the covenant doesn't protect her anymore." Seraphine went still. The covenant. Not the family crest. Not the medallion. The covenant. The actual instrument of authority in the Mafia alliance structure. The encrypted ledger system and bloodline agreements and diplomatic recognition that Ferrante had explained to her 3 years ago when he pressed the platinum bracelet into her hands. The thing she had understood, in that moment, that she had quietly become the keeper of without anyone formally designating her as such. The thing that made her, not the crest, not the title, not any visible symbol, the actual load-bearing element of the Vescari Syndicate's relationship with the 5 families. "How do they know about the covenant?" she said. "That's what I'm asking you." She looked at him. "Damien, I need to think." "Tell me how they know." "I don't know how they know. You just told me you've been managing this thing for years without telling me. You've been running alliances and protecting agreements and building financial structures, And apparently nobody in this world does anything without running it through you first. And now someone knows about the covenant, and you don't know how, and I need you to tell me. I don't know." Her voice stayed level, but the level cost something this time. She could feel it, the effort of it. 11 years of maintaining this particular register, and tonight it was costing her in a way that the other nights hadn't. "I don't know how they found it. The only people who know what the covenant is and what I am in relation to it are the 5 family patriarchs, Ferrante, Della Mara, Vukovic, the Trans. That is the complete universe of people who have that information." Damien looked at her. She heard it at the same time he did. The thing she had just said, held up against what she knew. The complete universe of people who have that information. 5 patriarchs. She thought of Ferrante calling her in the car. His voice careful and dry and precise, everything chosen deliberately. She thought of the covenant account frozen. She thought of a frozen account that required the financial signature she had used, the specific pattern that would be recognizable to someone who had watched her build enough structures to know what her fingerprint looked like. The patriarchs had watched her build structures. For 3 years, Ferrante most closely of all. "No," she said quietly. Not a denial. A calculation that had arrived at an answer she was checking against itself. Seraphine. "It's not Ferrante," she said, more to herself than to him. "It's not any of them. They lowered their heads tonight. They deferred. You don't do that if you're running the operation that's trying to destroy what I represent." "Unless the deference was performance," Damien said. And the way he said it, the flat, exhausted, logical way, the way of a man who has had so many floors give out under him in the last 2 hours that he has stopped being surprised by the sensation, told her that he was right and that she had known it the moment the Cayman account message arrived and had been refusing to finish the thought. Unless the deference was performance, unless the moment in the ballroom, the lowered heads, the wordless recognition, the weight of all those men choosing to direct their deference toward her, had been the most sophisticated element of the entire plan. The element designed to make her believe she was the one with the real authority, the one with the true support, the one who held the covenant. Because a woman who believes she is protected doesn't run. A woman who believes the 5 most powerful men in the room are standing behind her doesn't disappear into the infrastructure she's built, doesn't pull the emergency protocols, doesn't go dark. A woman who believes she's holding all the cards walks through the front door, right into whatever is waiting on the other side. The phone on the desk, the old one, her husband's father's emergency line, rang again. Neither of them reached for it. It rang 4 times. 5. Stopped. Then Seraphine's phone rang. The number was Ferrante's. She looked at it. She looked at Damien. She answered it. "Don Ferrante," she said. The voice that came back was not Ferrante's. It was a woman's voice, calm, almost gentle. The kind of calm that has been cultivated deliberately over a long time by someone who understands that the most frightening thing you can do to a person who is afraid is refuse to sound threatening. "Mrs. Vescari," Vanessa Hale said, "I think it's time we stopped pretending you haven't known about each other for quite a while." Seraphine did not move. "Don Ferrante sends his regrets," Vanessa continued. "He's been indisposed since about 11 o'clock. He's perfectly fine. He'll stay that way as long as the next 20 minutes go the way I'd like them to go." Damien was watching Seraphine's face. She kept it still. She kept everything still. "What do you want?" Seraphine said. "The covenant ledgers," Vanessa said. "The encrypted access codes. The diplomatic contact registry. All of it. You know what I mean, and you know you're the only person who can provide it. And I think you also know that the window for providing it with everyone still in the condition you'd prefer them to be in is..." A pause. Brief. Precisely calculated. Approximately 18 minutes now. Seraphine looked at Damien. He looked back at her. In his eyes was something she had not seen in a very long time. Not since the early years, before the Empire got between them. The look of a man who is completely out of answers and is placing the full weight of what comes next on someone else. Not out of weakness, but out of the particular courage it takes to admit that someone else in the room knows more than you do, and that the only way through is to trust them with it. He gave her nothing with his face except that. It was enough. Seraphine drew one breath. Then she said to Vanessa Hale very quietly, the thing she had been building toward without knowing it for 11 years. "You should have made sure I had less time." And she ended the call. She looked at Damien. "We have 18 minutes," she said, "and we are going to use all of them." 18 minutes. Seraphine was already moving before the phone left her hand. She crossed to the desk, pulled open the bottom left drawer, the one Damien had never asked about because it had always looked empty, and removed a flat metal case the size of a hardcover book. Inside it, a second drive, older than the one she'd set on the desk earlier, wrapped in a cloth that had the slight waxy texture of material designed to block passive scanning. A folded sheet of paper with 11 rows of alphanumeric sequences written by hand in ink that she had mixed herself from a formula she'd memorized rather than written down. And a phone, charged, clean, registered to a name that had no connection to any Vescari entity or any entity adjacent to it. Damien watched her without speaking. She picked up the handwritten sheet and looked at it for 3 seconds, memorizing the 4th and 7th rows, then held it over the small glass ashtray on the corner of the desk and burned it. The paper was treated to catch fast and leave minimal residue. It was gone in under 10 seconds. She crushed the ash with her thumb and wiped her hand on the inside of her jacket where it wouldn't show. "The Covenant ledgers are not in this building," she said. She kept her voice at a working volume, not low, not loud, the voice of someone managing a problem rather than reacting to one. "They're not in any building connected to the Viscari name. Vanessa doesn't have them, which means whatever she's using Ferrante as leverage for, she can't actually verify whether I've given her what she's asking for until she has independent confirmation. Which she'll get from someone who knows what the ledgers contain," Damien said. He was keeping up. "Good. Which narrows it considerably. There are 5 people who have seen the full ledger structure. 3 of them are family patriarchs. One of them is me." She paused. "The 5th is a man named Elias Vance. He's a forensic accountant who worked the original Covenant documentation when Ferrante structured it 20 years ago. He retired to Portland. He's been off the board for a decade." She found Raymond Gould. Seraphine confirmed. "So, yes, Vance is potentially a vulnerability. I need to know if he's already been contacted." "How do you reach him?" "I don't. Not directly. There's a protocol. He set it up himself, old school. A classified ad in a specific section of the Portland Alternative Weekly. A particular phrasing. He monitors it. If the ad runs, he goes to a specific location and waits for 48 hours. Damien looked at her. "You built a dead drop system with a retired forensic accountant." "He built it. I just know it exists." She was already on the clean phone, navigating to the digital submission portal for the publication. He was careful. He understood what he'd touched when he worked the Covenant documentation. He spent 10 years building himself an exit that couldn't be reversed. "Like you." She typed the classified ad text, 7 words in a specific arrangement that looked like someone selling a mid-century dining table, and submitted it without looking up. Then she set the phone face down and looked at Damien. "We have 15 minutes now," she said. "I need Della Mara's direct line." Corrado Della Mara. He's the one patriarch who wasn't at the estate before tonight's ceremony. He arrived 40 minutes before the rite, came in through the east entrance with a reduced security detail, and left 30 seconds after I walked out. He didn't wait for the room to settle. He was gone before Vanessa had finished reading the room. She watched Damien's face absorb this. That's not the behavior of a man who watched something unexpected happen and needed time to process. That's the behavior of a man who got what he came for. Della Mara. Damien said the name again, slowly, with the weight of a man examining an object. He's handled 1,000 times and is now holding under a light he's never used before. Corrado has been... I don't know what Corrado has been. I know what he did tonight. I know that the financial layering on Vanessa's operation has the structural signature of a very specific school of offshore accounting that Della Mara's organization has used for 30 years. I didn't make that connection until an hour ago because I was looking at the operation as a Chicago problem and not as a... She stopped. "Give me his direct line." Damien crossed to the primary safe, not the secondary one, the one he knew about, and worked the combination. She had the combination memorized but had never used it without his knowledge, which was one of the distinctions she maintained even now, even after everything, because the distinctions mattered to her in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't spent 11 years threading the needle between operating independently and actively deceiving the person she had married. He removed a small leather notebook, paged through it. "Read her a number." She dialed on the clean phone. It rang twice. A man answered. Not Delamara, a gatekeeper, a voice she didn't recognize. Tell Don Delamara that the keeper of the covenant is calling, she said. Tell him I have 12 minutes before I stop being available and start being his problem instead of his asset. A pause. Muffled movement. 30 seconds of silence that felt longer than 30 seconds because every second was a second of the 18 she didn't have. Then Delamara's voice, warm, northern Italian, the particular warmth of a man who uses warmth the way other men use ice. Seraphine. Corrado. She matched his warmth exactly and put nothing behind it. You left early tonight. I had another engagement. You left before the room finished settling. That's not like you. A pause. She could hear him breathing. She could hear him calculating. I didn't feel there was anything left for me to observe. Because you'd already seen everything you needed to see, or arranged everything that needed to be arranged. She kept her voice even. Not accusatory. Informational. The distinction mattered because accusation closes a conversation, and she needed this one open. Corrado, I'm not calling to confront you. I'm calling because whatever you think you've arranged with Vanessa Hale and whatever her organization has promised you, I need you to understand something in the next 30 seconds. I'm listening. She froze the contingency account. She's holding Ferrante. She has primary office system access through Chen, and she has 17 months of financial intelligence on the Viscari structure. She also, as of approximately 40 minutes ago, has Costello. She paused. Heard nothing from his end. Continued. What she does not have is the covenant. What she does not have is the contact registry, the bloodline agreements, or the encryption keys. And what she does not have, what no one has except me, is the relationship with the fifth party. Silence on the line. She pressed it. You know what I mean by the fifth party? More silence. And then, there. The slight shift in his breathing. The tell of a man who has just received information that his operational partners apparently did not share with him. There is no fifth party, Delamara said carefully. There are 4 family patriarchs in this alliance, she said, and there has always been a 5th signatory, a party that the 4 of you agreed when the covenant was first established would function as the tie-breaking authority in the event that the 4 families reached a deadlock. A party that was kept off every official document precisely because its function was to remain unknown until it was needed. She waited. Vanessa doesn't know about the 5th party because you didn't tell her, because you couldn't tell her without revealing that you knew about it. Which means whatever Vanessa has promised you in exchange for your cooperation, she cannot deliver it without my active participation, because the 5th party will not recognize any transfer of covenant authority that doesn't come through me. The silence this time was different, longer. The silence of a man revising an architecture very quickly. How do I know you're not? You don't, she said. That's the position she's put you in. She's made it so that the only way to verify whether I'm telling the truth is to not freeze my account and not hold Ferrante and give me the room I need to demonstrate it, which is inconvenient for you. But the alternative is committing fully to a woman who just revealed to you in this phone call that there are things about the covenant structure she didn't tell you. And in my experience, Corrado, when a partner doesn't tell you something foundational about the agreement you've made with them, it's not an oversight. She heard him exhale. 7 minutes, she said. That's how long I have before the timeline Vanessa set becomes irrelevant in a way that's bad for everyone. Make a decision. She ended the call before he could respond. Damien was staring at her. Is there a 5th party? Not the way I described it, she said. She was already moving toward the door. But there's enough ambiguity in the original covenant documentation that a man who is reconsidering his position will spend the next several hours trying to verify rather than committing further. That's all I needed. You bluffed Delamara. I gave him a reason to pause. Now we move. She picked up both drives, the clean phone, and the metal case. She looked at him. Do you have a way to reach Marco without going through any channel that runs through the primary office? I have his personal cell. Call him. Tell him to bring the car to the service entrance on Mott Street. Not the building's garage, not the main entrance. Mott Street. He'll know which door. Damien called. While he did, Seraphine went to the wall behind the bookcase, not the bookcase itself, the wall behind it, and pressed a specific point in the plaster that was indistinguishable from the surrounding wall unless you knew it by touch. A section of the wall gave slightly. Inside, not a room, not a passage. Just a shallow alcove approximately 8 inches deep and 2 feet wide. In the alcove, a firearm she had placed there 4 years ago and checked every 3 months since. A Sig Sauer P226, cleaned and loaded, with 2 additional magazines on a small magnetic mount. She removed it, checked the chamber. The motion was practiced and economical. Not the movement of someone performing competence, but of someone for whom this was simply a technical step in a sequence of technical steps. Damien finished the call and turned to find his wife holding a firearm with the relaxed certainty of someone who had been holding firearms for considerably longer than he had ever known about. He said nothing about it. This, she thought, was one of the ways people surprised you. The moments when they chose not to ask the question. "Marco is 3 minutes out," he said. "Good." She tucked the weapon. "We need to get to the Sutton Street location before Vanessa's people do." "What's at Sutton Street?" "The actual Covenant ledgers." He looked at her. "I told you they weren't in any building connected to the Vescari name," she said. "Sutton Street is a building connected to a literary estate management company incorporated in Delaware. The woman whose name is on the lease has been dead for 6 years. The office on the 3rd floor has been paying its rent electronically for 6 years from a trust account that would take a very motivated forensic examiner approximately 8 months to connect to anything in this world." She moved toward the hallway. "Come on." They went through the kitchen, down the service stairs. Not the elevator, never the elevator in a situation like this. Elevators were sealed boxes with one exit, and out through the back of the building into the cold. The alley smelled like the city always smelled at this hour. Exhaust and wet concrete and the specific urban cold that has no natural equivalent, a cold produced by the compression of too many people and too much machinery into too small a space. Marco had the car on Mott Street with the engine running. They got in without speaking. Marco pulled away from the curb before the doors were fully closed. The practiced pull of a man who has been doing this long enough that urgency is just another gear. Seraphine's clean phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from the number she had used for the Cayman transfer. The intermediary. 3 words. "They have me." She looked at the words for 2 seconds. Then she typed back. "Confirm status. Are you secure?" No response came. She put the phone face down on her knee. She looked at the city moving past the window. The late-night streets, the bodega lights, the particular quality of New York at this hour. When the performance of the day has been stripped away, and what's left is just the raw mechanical city, indifferent and relentless and vast. "The intermediary," she said quietly. "They've reached him." Damien was watching the road. "How much does he know?" "The account structure, the transfer protocols. Not the ledger location, not the encryption keys." She paused. "Not the 5th party." He glanced at her sideways. "There actually isn't one," she said, "but he doesn't know that. Which means they'll spend time trying to make him confirm what I told Delamara, and he'll spend time telling them he doesn't know what they're talking about, and they'll spend more time deciding whether to believe him. That's time." Damien said quietly, "How long have you been doing this?" She looked at him. "Doing what specifically?" "Building contingencies inside contingencies. Having exits prepared before you know you need them. Running scenarios." He stopped. "How long has your brain been operating this way?" She looked back at the window. "Since about the 3rd year, when I understood what this life actually required." "You could have told me." "You would have told me I was catastrophizing." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Probably." They rode in silence for a minute. Marco took a right turn that cut 2 blocks off the standard route, which told her Marco had been monitoring traffic patterns and had already made the adjustment before being asked. She had chosen Marco well, 7 years ago. She had chosen a lot of things well, quietly, without credit, over a long time. The building on Sutton Street was a 5-story pre-war walk-up with a ground-floor dry cleaner that had been there since 1987 and showed no signs of changing. The literary estate office on the 3rd floor had no sign on the door. The hallway smelled like old carpet and the specific mustiness of a building that was well-maintained but not renovated. Marco stayed with the car. They went up. Seraphine had the key in her hand before they reached the 2nd floor landing. The lock was a standard tumbler externally. Inside, there was a secondary lock that required a code sequence she had memorized and changed every 90 days. She worked both, opened the door, and they stepped into the dark. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She crossed to the desk by the window and turned on a small lamp that threw a pool of warm light across approximately 6 square feet and left the rest of the room in shadow. The shadow was fine. She knew the room. The desk had 3 drawers on the right side. She opened the bottom one, removed a false floor she had installed herself 4 years ago, the kind of basic carpentry she had learned from a YouTube channel and practiced in a storage unit in Queens until she could do it cleanly. Beneath the false floor, a fireproof sleeve. Inside the sleeve, a drive and a sealed envelope. She removed both. Set them on the desk. Damien stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold office air. He was breathing steadily. She could hear it. "This is everything," she said. "The ledgers, the bloodline agreements, the diplomatic registry, the encryption keys, all of it. And you've had it here the whole time. For 4 years. He put his hand on the edge of the desk beside her, not touching her, just present. She registered it. "What do we do with it?" he said. "We don't give it to her. We don't hide it again. They found the Cayman account, and they'll eventually find this location if they have enough time and resources. We need to move it to a position where it's protected not by secrecy, but by—" She stopped. Heard something. Both of them heard it. Footsteps on the stairs. Not Marco. Marco had his own signal, 3 short taps before ascending, and the sound on the stairs was the sound of multiple people trying to move quietly and not fully succeeding. The particular cadence of people who are trained for this, but are still people, and still make the sounds that people make on old wooden stairs, no matter how carefully they place their feet. Seraphine counted the steps. 4 people. Maybe 5. She looked at Damien. He had a weapon in his hand that she hadn't seen him draw. He had always been fast, that had always been true, and his face had gone to the specific place it went when the situation was physical. She had seen it rarely. She recognized it. "The window," she said quietly. He shook his head. "3rd floor. The fire escape is 12 inches to the left of the sill. It's been there for 80 years. It'll hold." He looked at the window. "I checked it," she said, 6 months ago." "Of course you did." She tucked the drive and the envelope inside her jacket, flat against her ribs. She killed the desk lamp. The room went dark and her eyes began adjusting immediately, pulling detail from the ambient light coming through the window, the street light below, the faint reflection off the opposite building's windows. The footsteps on the stairs had stopped, which was worse than if they had kept moving. She crossed to the window, unlocked it. The mechanism was old and stiff, and she had to use both hands, and it made a sound. Not loud, but in the silence of the stopped footsteps it was loud enough. The door came in. Not kicked, the lock picked, which told her the people in the hallway were professionals, which she had assumed, but which was now confirmed. The door swung open, and the first man through moved low and fast and came up in the far corner of the room with a weapon raised before his eyes, had finished adjusting to the dark. Seraphine was already at the window. Damien fired once, not at the first man, past him, at the shape in the doorway behind him, because the first man through a door in a tactical entry is the decoy, and the second man is the one who does the work. And Damien had known this since before Seraphine met him, and some things you don't forget. The shape in the doorway went down. The first man in the corner pivoted toward the muzzle flash. Seraphine went through the window. The fire escape was exactly where she had measured it. Cold iron, under her hands, the grating rough against her palms. The city suddenly present below her in a way it hadn't been inside the insulated stillness of the office. She moved down. Not dropped. Moved, controlled descent, the ladder ringing in the cold air as she went. Above her, through the window, she heard the sounds of the room, the movement, the brief violent scramble of close-quarters physical encounter, one more shot that she felt in her chest before she heard it. Then silence. She stopped on the 2nd-floor landing of the fire escape. Her heart was hitting the inside of her sternum with a force that she registered as a physical sensation rather than a fear response. She had trained herself out of the fear response years ago, and what was left was just the body doing its work. Blood and oxygen and muscle doing what they were built for. She looked up. Damien came through the window. He was moving and he was intact, and he was moving with the economy of someone who had taken a hit but had made the decision to process it later, and she let herself take in exactly the information she needed and no more, because this was not the moment for anything that slowed her down. He reached her landing. He was holding his left side with his left arm, not gripping, holding, the automatic pressure of a body trying to manage pain, while the person controlling it remained focused on something else. She looked at his face. He looked back at hers. "Moving," he said. They went down. Marco had the car 3 feet off the curb before they cleared the alley entrance. He didn't ask. She directed him with 2 words, a cross street, a direction, and he went without question. Damien sat beside her and breathed with the focused regularity of someone managing pain through the breath. She pulled back the left side of his jacket. The shirt underneath was dark and wet. She pressed her palm flat against it, and he pulled air sharply through his nose and said nothing. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable," he said, which in this world meant bad enough to matter, not bad enough to stop. She kept her palm where it was. The city moved outside the windows. In her jacket, flat against her ribs on the opposite side from her weapon, the drive and the sealed envelope with the full Covenant ledgers rode against her heartbeat. Her clean phone lit up. Not a call. A text. From a number she didn't recognize. 4 words and a location. Council. 2 hours. Come. She looked at the text. She showed it to Damien. He read it. His jaw tightened against the pain or against what the text meant, or both. "Vukovic," she said. The phrasing. "Come instead of attend or convene," that's his word. He sends his people to places with that word. She looked at the location. A cross street in Lower Manhattan that she knew by a different name than the one anyone used on a map. "It's the tribunal." "The tribunal hasn't been convened in 23 years, she said. "I know." If Vukovic is calling the tribunal, then at least one patriarch has broken with whatever arrangement Delamara and Vanessa put together. At least one of them is putting the formal structure above the operational play. She looked at the location again. "Or it's a trap." Damien looked at her. She looked back. "We go," she said. "With me bleeding in the back of the car." "With you bleeding in the back of the car." She pressed her palm harder against his side. "Marco." "Already going," Marco said from the front, and took a turn that confirmed he had seen the text or had been monitoring the phone's screen in the rear view, which was a conversation for another time. The drive took 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Seraphine went through the Covenant documentation in her memory, not the physical drive, her memory, the version she had built in her head over 4 years of reading and rereading until she could reproduce any section of it from a standing start. She went through the bloodline agreements. She went through the diplomatic registry. She went through the clauses relating to the transfer of authority and the conditions under which the council could convene an emergency tribunal. She found the clause she needed. She held it in her mind and tested it from every angle she could access in 11 minutes. It held. The tribunal location was a converted underground space beneath a building that had been a cathedral for 40 years and a storage facility for 30 years after that, and which had been purchased through a proxy entity 14 years ago by a collective holding that would take considerable effort to trace back to any of the 5 families. The entrance was through a loading dock. Marco stopped at the corner. Seraphine looked at Damien. "Can you walk?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Yes," he said again, with more precision. They got out. Marco stayed. The loading dock had 2 men outside it that she recognized. Not Vukovic's people, Delamara's, which she processed as information and cataloged without showing. The men looked at Seraphine, looked at Damien, looked at the dark stain on Damien's left side, did not move to stop them, which meant Delamara had made his decision. The tunnel below the loading dock was concrete and cold and long, longer than she remembered from the one time she had been here before, which was 12 years ago under entirely different circumstances, accompanying Damien's father to a meeting she had not been invited into, but had been permitted to wait in the anteroom for. She had used the time in the anteroom productively. She always used waiting time productively. The chamber at the end of the tunnel was, she registered this and moved past it, much fuller than she had anticipated. Not just the patriarchs, their full councils, soldiers arranged along the walls, the specific architecture of a formal convening, the weight of the old protocols, the recognition that whatever was happening in this room had been organized faster than the timeline she'd been working with should have allowed, which meant it had been organized before tonight, which meant at least some of what had happened in the last several hours had been anticipated by someone she had not anticipated anticipating it. She filed that, walked forward. The chamber went quiet as she entered it in a way that was different from the ballroom going quiet. The ballroom had been the quiet of shock. This was the quiet of anticipation, the held breath of people who are waiting for something they believe is about to resolve. At the far end of the chamber, behind a long stone table, sat Vukovic, Della Mara, and the Tran brothers. Ferrante's chair was empty. On the chair beside it, where the fifth patriarch's representative traditionally sat, was a woman Seraphine had never seen before. Late 60s. Gray hair pulled back with absolute severity. Wearing a suit that had no jewelry and no ornament of any kind, hands flat on the table in front of her. Seraphine looked at the woman. The woman looked back. "Mrs. Vescari," Vukovic said, his voice carried in the stone chamber. "There are things that need to be said tonight that have not been said in 23 years. And there is a woman in this building whose account of those things the council requires." "Where is Ferrante?" Seraphine said. "Don Ferrante is being attended to. He is alive. He will remain so." "And Vanessa Hale?" A slight movement from the soldiers at the far wall, a door she hadn't fully registered opening. And Vanessa Hale walked into the chamber with two of Vukovic's men flanking her. Not holding her, flanking her, which was a distinction that told Seraphine the situation was more complicated than custody. Vanessa looked at Seraphine across the length of the chamber. She was wearing the same gown from the ballroom. The family crest still hung around her neck, catching the cold light of the chamber. Her composure was intact in the way that composure is intact when it is being held in place by a level of will that is very close to its own limit. She looked at Seraphine. She said nothing. But what was in her eyes, in that first unguarded second before the composure fully reasserted itself, was not defiance and not fear. And not the calculation Seraphine had been watching for 14 months. It was the look of a woman who has prepared for every version of this moment except the one that is actually happening. Seraphine reached into her jacket. She removed the drive and the sealed envelope. She set them on the stone table in front of the council. "I'll need a projector," she said, "and approximately 40 minutes. What I'm going to show you will require some of you to answer questions you have not been asked in a very long time. I suggest you prepare for that." She looked at the woman in the fifth seat. The woman looked back at her with an expression that was impossible to read and that Seraphine intended, in the next 40 minutes, to read completely. Beside her, Damien was breathing through his nose in the controlled way of a man managing pain by method rather than willpower, and his left hand had found the back of her chair without him appearing to notice he'd done it. And she let it stay there because they were in a stone room underground with every dangerous person in their world arranged around them, and the next 40 minutes were going to determine whether any version of what they had built together survived the night. She pulled out the chair. She sat down. She opened the drive. The projector was old, a portable unit that one of Vukovic's men produced from a case in the anteroom, the kind of equipment that suggested this tribunal space had been used more recently than 23 years ago for things that didn't make it into any account Seraphine had access to. She noted that and moved past it. The drive connected through an adapter. The wall at the far end of the chamber was bare stone, pale enough to serve as a surface. The images it would throw would not be crisp. They would be legible, which was all she needed. She looked at the room while the equipment was being set up. Damien had been taken, at her instruction, issued quietly to one of the Tran brothers' men, who had responded without hesitation, which she filed, to a side room where someone with medical competence was attending to his side. She had watched him go with the specific attention of a woman cataloging the color of his face and the quality of his movement and making a private calculation about margins. The calculation had come back acceptable, not comfortable, acceptable. The woman in the fifth seat had not moved or spoken. Vanessa had been positioned at the end of the stone table, seated, not standing, which Seraphine had requested because a standing person can generate a performance, and she wanted Vanessa sitting with the weight of what was coming at her rather than performing through it. The two men who had flanked her on the way in were now behind her, 3 feet back, present but not restraining. Vanessa's hands were on the table. The family crest caught the cold light every time she breathed. Seraphine stood. 22 months ago, she said, a woman entered the orbit of the Vescari syndicate. This is what the council already knows. What the council may not know is when the operation actually began. She clicked to the first document on the drive. A corporate filing, registered in Delaware, time-stamped. 31 months ago. A staffing agency was incorporated. The registered agent is a shell entity. The shell entity traces to a holding company. The holding company, on the fourth layer, connects to a financial channel used exclusively by one organization in the last decade. She looked at Delamara. Delamara looked back at her with the expression of a man who has made his decision and is now sitting with it. Not comfortable, not defiant, present. "I know," she said, and she said it directly to him, not to the room, "that you did not intend for this to go where it went. I know that the arrangement you entered into was pitched to you as a restructuring, not a demolition. I know that what was described to you was a cleaner power distribution within the existing alliance, and that the destruction of the covenant itself was not part of what you agreed to." Delamara was very still. "I know this," she continued, "because the financial records show two separate payment structures. One funding the primary operation, Calvetti, Vanessa's placement, the administrative network inside the Viscari primary office, and a second structure, running parallel, funding things that the primary operations principals were not informed about, the three missing captains, the intermediary, Raymond Gould." She let that land. Someone was running a second operation inside the first one, using the first operation's infrastructure as cover for a set of objectives that went considerably further than any restructuring. She clicked to the next document. Transfer records. The parallel payment structure rendered in columns, dates, and amounts and routing numbers. "The source account for the parallel structure," she said, "is not the Calvetti operation. It is not the Delamara financial channel. It roots on the sixth layer, and I want the Council to understand that 6 layers of offshore architecture represents a significant investment in concealment, to an account held in the name of a woman who has been dead for 8 years. She looked at Vanessa. Vanessa's face was doing something that Seraphine had never seen it do in 14 months of watching. Not the composed calculation, not the warm surface metallic underneath performance. Something rawer. The face of a woman who is watching the specific version of exposure she did not prepare for. "Elena Marchetti," Seraphine said, "born 1961, died 2016 in a car accident in the south of France. She was the wife of a mid-level Calvetti associate and had no significant organizational role in her own right. She is not the kind of person whose name appears on the 6th layer of a sophisticated offshore financial structure unless someone put it there specifically because they believed no one would ever get through the first 5 layers to find it." She paused. Elena Marchetti was Vanessa Hale's mother. The chamber went completely still. Vanessa's jaw moved. Something was working behind her eyes, the rapid, almost mechanical reassessment of what had just been revealed and what it meant and whether there was a position remaining that could be managed. Seraphine watched it happen and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. What she felt was the particular exhaustion of a long problem arriving at its solution. Not triumph, not relief, just the weight of all the steps it had taken to get here, arriving simultaneously now that the destination was in sight. Vanessa Hale's father, Seraphine said, was not a Calvetti associate. Her father was a man named Robert Hale, who died in a federal prison in 2009 while serving a sentence for racketeering. His original conviction, 18 years prior, was the result of testimony provided by a cooperating witness. She clicked to the next document. A federal case summary, sanitized but legible. The cooperating witness in that case was a senior figure in the Viscari syndicate. She looked at the room. She let them reach it themselves. Vukovic got there first. She saw it cross his face, the sequence of it, the connection completing. The trans a moment later. Delamara, who had more of the context, had already arrived. Vanessa was looking at the stone table in front of her. The witness, Seraphine said, was Damien Viscari's father. Vanessa looked up. And what was in her face in that moment was not the mask and not the calculation and not any version of the performance she had been sustaining for 22 months of meticulous, patient, extraordinarily disciplined work. It was grief. Old grief. The kind that has been carried a long time and converted into fuel, burned slowly and steadily over years as the source of the energy required to plan something like this, to maintain something like this, to wake up every morning inside the life of the man whose family destroyed yours and keep the face in place and keep moving forward one deliberate step at a time. It was the grief of a woman who had started this at the age of 28 with a specific destination in mind and had arrived at it and was now discovering that arrival is never what the journey made it feel like it would be. Seraphine looked at her for a moment, just a moment. Then she turned back to the council. This is not a restructuring, she said. It is not an ambition play. It is not a power grab within the existing alliance. What Vanessa Hale built over 22 months, using resources provided by Delamara's channel and supplemented by a parallel operation funded from her dead mother's account, was a demolition instrument aimed specifically at the Vescry Syndicate. Every element of it was designed to fracture the alliance relationships that the Covenant protects. Because a destroyed Covenant is the only outcome that prevents the Vescari family from ever again providing the kind of testimony that put her father in a federal prison for the rest of his life. She stopped. She let the room sit with that. Vukovic leaned forward. The three captains. Alive, the woman in the fifth seat said. Every head in the room turned. The woman had not spoken until this moment. Her voice was measured and dry and carried the specific authority of someone who has not needed to perform authority for a very long time, because the reality of it has become self-evident to everyone in any room she enters. They are being held at a location I am prepared to disclose, the woman continued. They were taken not to be harmed, but to be kept from communicating tonight, specifically from communicating with Mrs. Vescari or with this council. Seraphine looked at her. Who ordered that? The woman looked back. I did. The room adjusted. Seraphine felt the adjustment rather than saw it. The collective recalibration of every person present, the resorting of the architecture of the situation around this new element. Who are you? Seraphine said. My name is Catherine Weil. I represent the interests of the fifth signatory party to the Covenant, the party whose existence you described to Don Delamara by telephone approximately 2 hours ago. A slight pause. You were right that it exists. You were wrong about what it is. Seraphine was very still. The fifth party is not a family, Catherine Weil said. It is not an organization in the sense you understand that term. It is a trust, a legal structure established at the same time as the Covenant, designed to hold the Covenant documentation in the event that no single human keeper could be identified or agreed upon by the four families. The trust has 3 trustees. I am one of them. She looked at Seraphine steadily. We have been watching this situation develop for 14 months. We chose not to intervene before tonight. Why? Seraphine said. Because the intervention needed to be yours, Catherine Weil said simply. If the trust had moved, it would have been read as an external imposition. The council would have been required to evaluate it as such. What happened instead is that the keeper of the Covenant, operating without institutional support, without formal authority, without any resource except her own intelligence and the relationships she built over 11 years, assembled the documentation required to expose this operation and brought it to the council of her own motion. She looked around the room. That is not the same as being rescued, and in this room, the distinction matters. The silence that followed had a different texture than any of the silences before it. Not tense, not the held breath of anticipated violence, something older and quieter. The silence of people sitting with a truth that has been present for a long time and has finally been said in the right room. Vukovic looked at Vanessa. The crest. Vanessa looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not defiance, and not surrender. The expression of a woman making a decision about the only thing she still controls, which is the manner in which she concedes. She reached up. She unclasped the chain. She set the family crest on the stone table with a sound that was very small and very final. Then she looked at Seraphine. He testified, she said. Her voice was steady. Your father-in-law. He sat in that room and he told them everything, and my father died in a federal cage 14 years later, having never once... She stopped. Her jaw worked. He never stopped believing it would be overturned. He died believing someone was going to fix it. Seraphine looked at her. I know, she said. You knew before tonight. I found the connection 8 months ago. The Hale name, the Marchetti account, the Calvetti link. She paused. I knew what you were. I didn't know what you'd lost. Something shifted in Vanessa's face, very slightly. The kind of shift that happens when a person receives information that doesn't fit the model they've been operating from, and the model has to expand to accommodate it. It doesn't change what you did, Seraphine said. Santino's wife called the security line because her husband didn't come home. 3 men were taken from their families tonight as operational instruments. The intermediary who handled my Cayman account is currently being held somewhere by people working for your parallel operation. Those aren't abstractions. She kept her voice level. Not cold. Level. Whatever was done to your family, and I'm not dismissing what was done to your family, it doesn't translate into a right to do it to theirs. Vanessa said nothing. She looked at the crest on the stone table. She looked at her own hands. Then she said very quietly the thing that Seraphine had not expected, and that landed in the chamber with the particular weight of something true. I know that. The room was silent. Vukovic looked at the council, at Delamara, at the Tran brothers, at Catherine Weil, the look of a man taking inventory of a shared moment and preparing to formalize it. The council will require a recess, he said. 1 hour. Seraphine nodded. She picked up the drive from the table. She picked up the sealed envelope. She walked toward the side room where Damien had been taken. The room was small and lit by a single overhead bulb and smelled like antiseptic and old stone. Damien was sitting on a low bench with his shirt open, and a man Seraphine didn't recognize working on his left side with the competent, unhurried movements of someone who has done this before in rooms that were not hospitals. The wound had been cleaned. It was being closed. It was, she assessed this from the doorway, going to be painful for a considerable time and was not going to kill him. He looked up when she came in. The man working on him kept working. She crossed the room and sat down beside him on the bench. Not across from him. Beside him. Close enough that the warmth was mutual and the proximity was a statement rather than an accident. He looked at her face and read it the way he had always been able to read her face when he was actually paying attention, which was not often enough, and which she had stopped resenting somewhere in the last several hours, having found that resentment required a level of energy she needed for other things. Well spoke, he said. She spoke. What did she say? Seraphine told him. All of it. The fifth party, the trust, the trustees, the 14 months of observation, the decision not to intervene until the intervention could be Seraphine's own motion. She told it in the flat, sequential way she told things when the events themselves carried enough weight that narration didn't require embellishment. Damien listened without speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Vanessa's father. Yes. My father's testimony. Yes. He looked at the wall across from him. The man working on his side had finished the primary closure and was beginning the bandaging, efficient and quiet. I didn't know about the testimony. I knew he cooperated once, in the early years. He told me it was minor, that it was nothing that touched anyone significantly. He paused. He lied. He protected you from knowing, Seraphine said, which is not the same thing, but it is also not entirely different. A man died in prison. A man who had done significant things that warranted a prison sentence died in prison, she said carefully. I'm not making it simple. It isn't simple. But Vanessa's father's choices and your father's choice to testify are two separate moral ledgers, and neither of them clears the other. He looked at her. She spent 22 months inside our life, he said. Yes. She was in our house. Yes. And He stopped. The man finished the bandaging and stepped back and gathered his materials and left the room with the discretion of a professional who has learned that the most valuable skill in his line of work is knowing when to be somewhere else. They were alone. I gave her the crest, Damien said, in front of every family, in front of you. I stood in that ballroom and I took the thing that my father gave me, and I put it around her neck, and I did it because I was... He stopped again. He had never been good at the sentences that required him to locate himself in his own emotional architecture. It had always been one of the things about him. I was stupid, he said finally. I was vain, and I was distracted, and I was exactly the version of myself that she needed me to be, and I was that version for 14 months, and it nearly... He looked at his hands. It nearly took everything. Seraphine looked at the side of his face. You also made the call to suspend Chen's access at 2 in the morning without asking me to explain myself first, she said. You also went through a window on a fire escape at 51 degrees with a wound in your side without asking where we were going. You also trusted me in a room underground with every dangerous person in our world watching when you had about 12% of the information you would have needed to justify that trust on rational grounds. She paused. People are not just their worst decisions, Damien. I decided that 11 years ago when I married you, and I haven't changed my position. He looked at her. It was not the look of a man receiving comfort. It was the look of a man receiving information that he was going to need to sit with for a long time before he understood it fully, but who recognized, in this moment, that the person delivering it was not doing so out of strategy or management, or the practiced emotional labor of a woman who has learned to smooth things over. She was doing it because she meant it. He reached out and put his hand over hers. She let him. Outside the small room, the tribunal recess was proceeding. She could hear the muffled sound of movement and voices through the stone. Not words, just the texture of an institution reorganizing itself around a new reality. She had been in enough rooms where that reorganization was happening to know its sound. It was not the sound of resolution. Resolution was quieter. This was the sound of people finding the language for something that had happened before the language existed. She thought about Costello. She had not addressed Costello in the chamber. She had presented the financial documentation of the parallel operation, the sourcing of the commission funds, the signature authority trail that led to the fourth name on the subsidiary account. She had put it in front of the council and let it be a fact rather than a condemnation, because condemnation was the council's function, not hers. What she had felt about it, the specific texture of learning that a man she had watched cross a ballroom floor toward her in what she had briefly, against her better training, allowed herself to believe was a genuine act of loyalty, had done it on instruction. She had not examined yet. She would examine it later. Later was full of things she would examine. The door opened. Vukovic's man looked in. "The council is ready." She stood. Damien started to stand. She put a hand on his shoulder, not pressing him down, just present, just the communication of a body to another body that says, "Let me assess this first." He stayed. She went back into the chamber. The room had reconfigured during the recess, not dramatically. The stone table was where it had been. The soldiers still lined the walls. But the arrangement of the people around the table had shifted in small ways that told her the hour had been used for more than waiting. Conversations had happened. Positions had been established. Catherine Weil was standing now, which she had not been before. Vanessa was still seated, but differently. Not the watched subject positioning she had held before the recess, something that read more like she had been included in a conversation rather than observed through one. Seraphine noted this, did not react to it, noted it. "The council has deliberated," Vukovic said, "and the council has reached a unanimous position, which has not occurred in this chamber in 23 years. We feel that fact is worth stating before the position itself." Seraphine stood at the head of the table. "The operation described in the documentation presented tonight constitutes a violation of the Covenant's foundational protections, specifically the provisions against infiltration of a member family's primary operations, the provisions against using Covenant financial infrastructure for operations directed against a member family, and the provisions against interference with the keeper's function." He paused. "The individuals responsible for the primary operation are subject to the council's judgment. The question of the parallel operation, the deeper layer, the three captains, the intermediary, the actions directed against individuals rather than institutions, is a separate matter that the council will address separately and fully." He looked at Vanessa. "Vanessa Hale will be held under council jurisdiction while the full scope of both operations is established. She is not to be harmed. She is not to be released. The question of her ultimate disposition will be addressed when the documentation is complete and all surviving parties have been heard." He looked at Seraphine. "The council unanimously recognizes Seraphine Viscari as the keeper of the covenant. This recognition is formal, documented, and entered into the covenant record as of tonight." He paused. This was, in the view of the council, already true. Tonight's event simply required it to be said. Catherine Weil nodded once, slowly, from her position at the end of the table. Seraphine looked at the room. At each face. She did not speak immediately. She allowed herself the honesty of the moment, not the performance of composure, but the actual reality of a woman who has spent 11 years holding something together with patience and intelligence and invisible labor, and who is now standing in a room where the invisible has been made visible, and the weight of that is neither light nor simple. "The three captains," she said, "I want them home before morning." "They will be," Weil said. "The intermediary in the Cayman situation." "Being located," Weil said. "He'll be found." "And Ferrante." A slight pause. Don Ferrante will require some time to recover. He is stable. He will be contacted when he's able. Seraphine nodded. She looked at Vanessa one more time. Vanessa was looking at the table, at the family crest sitting on the stone in front of her. She had not touched it since she set it down. She did not look like a woman who wanted to. She looked like a woman who has arrived somewhere she spent years traveling toward, and has found, at the destination, that the map she used to get here described a country that doesn't exist in the form she imagined it. That the thing she thought would feel like completion feels instead like the specific hollow of a purpose that has exhausted itself. Seraphine understood that feeling. She had felt something adjacent to it in the corridor outside the ballroom, 5 hours ago, when the footsteps had followed her through the door. The feeling of a long-held position finally resolving. The understanding that resolution is not the same as peace, and that you have to build the peace separately, from whatever materials the resolution leaves you. She left the chamber. She went back to the small room. Damien was standing now, carefully, with the tentative uprightness of a man whose body is arguing with his decision and losing. His shirt was buttoned. Someone had produced a clean one from somewhere, which made her briefly wonder what kind of operation maintained a supply of clean shirts in the anteroom of a criminal tribunal, and then she decided it was the kind of question that answered itself. He looked at her when she came in. She looked at him. "Done," she said. He exhaled. A long, slow, full-bodied exhale. The breath of a man releasing something he had been holding at tension for hours without being aware of the effort. "Costello," he said. "The council has it," she said. "Let them have it. He was with me for 19 years. I know. I need to—" He stopped. "I need to understand how I missed it." "You'll have time to understand it," she said. "Not tonight. Tonight we need to get you somewhere a doctor can look at what that man did to your side with better equipment than he had in that room." "I'm fine." "You're ambulatory. That's not the same thing." Something moved across his face. It might have been almost a smile, the ghost of one, the shape that a smile leaves in a face that is too tired and too wrung out for the full expression. "No," he said. "It's not." They left the building through the loading dock. Marco was where she'd left him. The engine idling, the heat on inside, the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting in cars outside difficult situations for long enough that waiting has become its own form of competence. He looked at them in the rear view as they got in. He looked at the fresh shirt on Damien and the evidence of the night on both their faces. He did not ask. "Hospital," Seraphine said. "Private?" Marco asked. "Private." He pulled away from the curb. The city outside the windows was beginning its shift toward morning. Not light yet. Not even the preliminary gray that precedes light. But a change in the quality of the darkness. A thinning. The particular hour when the city's nocturnal systems begin their handoff to the diurnal ones. When the delivery trucks start and the last bars close and the streets exist in a brief interval that belongs to neither the night nor the day. Seraphine sat beside Damien in the back of the car. His arm was against hers. She didn't move away. He didn't either. She thought about the Covenant ledgers, the drive and the sealed envelope, now back inside her jacket, flat against her ribs. She thought about what it would take to restructure the Covenant's protections in light of what had been exploited. The financial provisions would need to be rewritten. The signature authority protocols on subsidiary accounts needed to be redesigned from the ground up. The process for vetting personnel at the primary office level needed to be overhauled completely, and the responsibility for that vetting needed formal designation rather than the informal absorption of it that had been her practice for years. Formal. Everything that had been informal needed to become formal, not because formality was inherently superior to the work she had done in its absence, but because the informal architecture, the invisible holding together, the quiet labor that kept things standing without anyone acknowledging it was doing so, had made it possible for a very patient, very intelligent, very motivated woman to spend 22 months disassembling what had taken 11 years to build. Invisible things could be destroyed without witnesses. She would not be invisible anymore. She thought about what that meant and felt the weight of it. Not the power of it. The weight. Because formal authority in this world was not a reward. It was a liability. It made you a target in ways that the invisible position had not. And she had been a target tonight even from the invisible position, which told her the calculation had already changed And the choice was not between visibility and safety, but between visibility and a false sense of safety that had already proven insufficient. She would rather know what she was dealing with. She thought about the woman in the fifth seat, Catherine Weil, with her severe hair and her flat hands on the stone table, and her measured, precise voice delivering information that Seraphine had spent 14 months unable to access. The trust, the 3 trustees, the 14 months of observation, the deliberate non-intervention until the intervention could be Seraphine's own. She thought, I would have made the same decision. She thought, I'm not sure that makes it forgivable. She thought, those 2 things can both be true simultaneously, and in the morning she would contact Weil, and they would have the conversation that needed to be had, and it would not be comfortable, and it would be necessary. The private medical facility was in a converted building in the upper 20s, accessible through a ground-floor entrance that looked like a physical therapy practice because, on its legitimate business days, it was. A woman met them at the door, 60s, brisk, the body language of someone who has been woken at unusual hours often enough that she has stopped allowing it to register on her face. She looked at Damien's side, nodded once, led him through a door. He went. At the threshold, he turned and looked at Seraphine. She was standing in the entrance. The driver was in her jacket. The city was behind her through the glass door. She was not composed in the way she had been composed in the ballroom 5 hours ago. The effortless performed containment of a woman who had decided no one in that room would see her bleed. That version of composure had cost too much tonight and had been spent freely in the places where it needed to be spent, and what was left was something quieter and more honest. The face of a woman who is standing at the end of a very long night and has not yet decided what the morning is supposed to look like. Damien looked at her for a moment. I'm going to need time, he said, to understand what I owe you. You don't owe me anything, Seraphine. You married me, she said. I signed up for the same thing you did. We've both been running the version of this that we knew how to run. The problem was we weren't running it together. She paused. We can fix that. Or we can decide we can't. But not tonight, and not in this doorway. He looked at her. Tomorrow, she said. He nodded once. Then he went through the door. She stood in the entrance for a moment after it closed. Outside, through the glass, the city continued its slow transition toward morning. A delivery truck turned the corner. 2 people walked by on the opposite sidewalk, close together against the cold. A light came on in a window 3 floors up in the building across the street. Someone beginning their day, someone whose day began at this hour. Someone who had no awareness of the tribunal or the covenant or the 5 hours of the night that had just finished being the worst and most clarifying hours of Seraphine Viscari's adult life. She pressed her palm flat against the drive inside her jacket, felt the hard edge of it against her sternum. She thought about the clause she had found in the covenant documentation during the 11-minute car ride to the tribunal, the clause she had tested from every angle her mind could reach in 11 minutes, the one that it held. The provision that the keeper's authority was not contingent on the recognition of any individual within a member family, that it preceded and survived any internal power structure, that it was, in the language of the original documentation, self-executing, which was legal language for the idea that it did not require anyone's permission to be true. It had been true before tonight. It would be true tomorrow morning. She had not needed the council to make it true. She had needed them to say it, because in this world, the said thing and the true thing were not always the same thing, and the gap between them was where most of the damage happened. She had spent 11 years working in the gap. She was done working in the gap. She pushed the door open. She walked out into the cold. Marco had the car at the curb. She got in. He looked at her in the rear view and raised his eyebrows slightly. The question of where. She thought about the Viscari estate. She thought about the apartment on the Upper West Side. She thought about the literary estate office on Sutton Street with its broken-in door and its false-floored desk drawer and the ash of a burned document still sitting in the glass ashtray. Drive, she said. I'll tell you when. He pulled away from the curb. The city moved around the car. The streets in this hour between night and morning were as close to empty as New York ever got. Not empty, not quiet, but reduced to its essential machinery, the systems that ran underneath the performed city that everyone moved through during the day. She had always felt more at home in this version of the city than in the daytime version. It had always seemed more honest. She looked out the window. She thought about Vanessa Hale sitting at the stone table in an underground chamber with a family crest she would never wear again in front of her, and the look on her face when the grief had shone through the composure, and the things she had said, "I know that." Two words that cost considerably more than they appeared to cost. The particular expenditure of a person conceding, not to an opponent, but to a truth they had been outrunning for 22 months. Seraphine did not feel victorious. She felt the way she had felt in the corridor outside the ballroom. Not triumph, not grief, not anger. The thing that came after you'd held yourself at a particular tension for a very long time and had finally been able to stop holding. The release that doesn't feel like relief because your body has forgotten, temporarily, what it was like before the tension. She would remember. It would take time. She would remember. The first gray light was beginning at the eastern edge of the sky when Marco turned onto the FDR and the river came into view, dark and wide and indifferent, moving south toward the harbor the way it always moved, carrying whatever the city sent into it without comment or complaint. She watched it for a long time. Then she sat back in the seat. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She was not built for sleeping in cars. Her body treated it as a security vulnerability, and she had never managed to train it out of that. But she allowed herself something close to stillness, the kind of stillness that is not absence but presence without performance. Her hands in her lap, her breathing regular, the drive solid against her ribs. Tomorrow she would call Weil. Tomorrow she would begin the rewrite of the Covenant's financial provisions. Tomorrow she would sit across from Damien in whatever room they chose, and they would have the conversation that 11 years of marriage and one extraordinary night had made unavoidable and necessary and possibly, finally, possible. Tomorrow was going to be long. For now, there was the car and the river and the city coming slowly back to light outside the windows, and the particular quality of arriving at the far side of something terrible and discovering that you are still, despite everything, entirely and completely yourself. She had not expected that to feel the way it felt. She had not expected it to feel like enough. It did.